When I first arrived in England, everything felt so new and exciting, like I was stepping into a different world. During one of our lessons, I remember this moment clearly, because it really stuck with me. We were sitting in a small classroom, the kind where the windows let in just enough light to make the room feel cozy. Our teacher was standing at the front, explaining something about vocabulary, when one of the other students raised his hand. He asked a question that I'd been wondering about, too. "You mentioned we should know 3,000 words," the student said. "But where exactly can we find these 3,000 words? Which ones are the most important for us to focus on?" The room got quiet as we all waited for the answer, and I could feel my curiosity growing. I had come to England with the goal of improving my English, and knowing which words to learn seemed like the key to unlocking so much more. The teacher paused for a moment, probably thinking about how to answer in the simplest way possible, but I was already leaning forward, eager to find out. I remember the day when one of my classmates asked a question that had been on my mind, too. It was a typical gray afternoon in England, and we were all sitting in class, notebooks open, trying to absorb everything our teacher was saying. The topic that day was vocabulary, and our teacher had mentioned something about how knowing 3,000 words would really help us in learning English. That's when one of the students raised his hand and asked, "How can we find these 3,000 words?" "Where's the list we can follow?" I could see the teacher smile slightly, as if he had heard this question many times before. Then he replied, "Well, you can always Google a list of the 3,000 most common words in English, but honestly, that won't help you as much as you think." We all sat up a little straighter, curious about why that was. The teacher continued, explaining that just memorizing words from a list wasn't the best way to really learn a language. "If you start learning words from a list," he said, "you'll be learning them outside of any context. You'll be learning words that aren't part of a story, words that don't have any connection to the situations you find yourself in. You won't see how these words fit with others in sentences, and without that, the words won't stick in your long-term memory. Instead, you'll only remember them for a short while." I sat there, thinking about what he said. It made sense. I had already experienced this myself, learning a word one day and forgetting it the next because it hadn't really meant anything to me. It wasn't part of something bigger, something I could relate to. This was a moment that made me rethink how I was approaching learning English, and it stayed with me as I continued on my journey. I remember one lesson in particular, where our teacher was explaining how we should approach learning new words in English. It was a chilly morning, and the small classroom was filled with the sound of pens scribbling notes as we listened closely. One of the students had just asked about the best way to memorize vocabulary. The teacher, standing at the front, nodded and gave a small smile, as if he had been waiting for someone to ask that very question. He began to explain that while it might seem like a good idea to just learn words from a list, it wasn't that simple. "You see," he said, "this system works for some words, basic words, the ones we use to describe the things and people around us." He paused, looking around the room to make sure we were following. For example, words like mother, father, apple, blue, orange, dog, cat, book, car, house, city, boy, girl, water, cinema, or paper. As he listed these words, I found myself picturing each one, simple and familiar. These were words I could understand and easily remember because they were part of my everyday life, just like he said. But then he continued, explaining that learning English wasn't just about knowing these simple words. "Yes, these are the words you can memorize easily," he said. but they won't help you with more complex conversations or understanding how the language truly works." His words stuck with me because I had been trying to learn English just by memorizing random words from books and lists, and I was starting to see why that wasn't enough. I needed more than just the basics to really feel comfortable with the language. It was clear that there was so much more to learn, and this was just the beginning of my journey. One afternoon in class, I remember our teacher talking about how we learn words, and it really made me think. It was a rainy day, typical for England, and the classroom felt warm compared to the chilly weather outside. We were discussing vocabulary again, and the teacher was explaining why some words are easier to learn than others. "You see," he said, "there are certain words that are simple because you can easily picture them in your mind. For example, when I say the word dog, you know right away what it means. You can imagine it, maybe a brown dog with floppy ears or a small one with a wagging tail. It's something clear, something you've seen before." I nodded along, realizing that it was true. I could think of the word dog without much effort, and it felt natural, like it was already part of my vocabulary. But then the teacher went on. "Now, when you try to learn words like appreciate or suppose, it's not the same. You can't just picture these words in your head as easily. They're more abstract, harder to connect with a clear image or feeling." I remember thinking about how right he was. I had tried to memorize words like that before, and they always seemed to slip away, no matter how many times I read them. Words like dog or apple stuck with me because I could see them, imagine them. But words like appreciate, that was different. I couldn't picture it, couldn't touch it, or feel it the way I could with other words. The teacher's explanation made it clear why some words were more difficult to grasp. It wasn't just about memorizing. It was about understanding what the word represented. I sat there, realizing that learning English was going to take more than just lists of words. It was about truly connecting with the language in a deeper way. I remember one particular day in class when our teacher was talking about how many of us struggle with learning English. It was a quiet afternoon, and I could hear the rain lightly tapping against the windows, a sound that had become so familiar during my time in England. We were discussing vocabulary again, and our teacher was trying to explain why so many students, including myself, found it hard to move beyond basic words. He told us something that really stuck with me. "You see," he said, "many students start out learning English by memorizing lists of words. At first it seems like it's working, and they feel like they're making progress. They believe they can learn the language just by memorizing these lists." I nodded along because that was exactly how I had started. I would go over long lists of words every night, feeling proud each time I memorized a new one. It felt like I was getting somewhere. But then the teacher said something that changed how I thought about learning. "The problem is," he continued, "this only works up to a certain point. Once you've learned about 1,000 words, the method stops being as effective. That's when you need to switch to a new system. If you want to learn more advanced words, you have to learn them through sentences, through context." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. I could feel the whole class paying close attention. When you see a word in a sentence, he explained, you don't just learn the word itself. You understand how it's used, what it means in different situations, and how it connects to other words. That's how you really remember it. As I listened, I realized that this was where I had been going wrong. I had hit a wall after memorizing the basics, and I didn't know why it was getting harder. The teacher's advice made so much sense to me. It wasn't enough to just know a word by itself. I needed to see it in action, in real sentences, to fully understand and remember it. That moment marked a shift in how I approached my studies. I knew there was still a long way to go, but now I had a clearer idea of how to keep moving forward. I remember one of the lessons where the teacher was talking about how we learn words, and it made me rethink everything I had been doing. It was a cold, windy day, and I was sitting in class feeling a bit frustrated with my progress. I'd been trying to memorize lists of words every night, going over them again and again, but I wasn't feeling like I was improving much. That day, the teacher said something that really opened my eyes. He told us, you can definitely learn words from lists, and many students do this at the start. But there's usually a limit to how far you can go with this method. That limit is often around 1,000 words. He paused, letting that sink in for a moment. I could feel a shift in the room as we all realized we had been focusing so much on those lists. Then he continued. Not only is there a limit, but this way of learning is also very slow. You may feel like you're learning a lot at first, but eventually it gets harder, and the progress becomes frustrating. As he said this, I nodded to myself because that's exactly what I had been experiencing. I was stuck, and I didn't know why. But then the teacher offered a solution. There are much better ways to learn, he said with a smile. We've already talked about some of them, like reading. My ears perked up because I knew that reading had been mentioned before, but I hadn't given it much thought. For beginners, he went on, one of the best books to read is Robinson Crusoe in simple English. It's a fantastic way to pick up new words while understanding a story at the same time. You can find it at www.robinsoncrusoeinlevels.com. I highly recommend it. I remember feeling a spark of hope when he said that. I had been struggling with lists, but maybe reading something like Robinson Crusoe would be different. Maybe it would help me learn words in a more natural way, like he had been telling us all along. I didn't know if it would work, but I was excited to give it a try. This was just one step in my journey, and I knew there were many more ahead of me, but at least now I had a new path to follow. One afternoon, during another one of our lessons, the teacher shared something that really caught my attention. It was a gray day. The kind where the clouds seem to hang low and the air feels damp. I was sitting near the window trying to keep up with everything he was saying. He was talking about how we learn words, not just in English but in any language, and what he said made so much sense to me. There's an interesting rule about learning words, he began, looking around the room at each of us. Every word that's important for you, that's really useful in your life, will keep coming back to you over and over again until you finally learn it. I thought about that for a moment. letting his words sink in. It was like he was describing something I hadn't realized but had always known deep down. He went on to explain, "It's very similar to how you learned your native language. Think about it. When we were children, we didn't study from lists of words. We just used the language. We listened to people talk, and the important words kept showing up in our lives, again and again. One day, we just understood them. We knew what they meant because we had heard them so many times." As he spoke, I started to remember moments from my own childhood, back when I was learning my first language. Words like apple or school didn't come from a textbook. They came from real life, from my parents, from my friends. They were part of my world. The teacher continued, "This is how we learn new words all our lives, even as adults. You don't stop learning, and you don't need to rely on memorizing lists forever. If a word is important, it will keep coming into your life, in conversations, in books, in movies, until one day it just clicks." I found this idea so comforting because it took away some of the pressure I had been feeling. I'd been so focused on memorizing lists of English words, trying to force them into my brain, but maybe I didn't need to do that. Maybe I just needed to trust the process a little more. It felt like I was learning in a more natural way, like the way I had learned my first language, and that gave me hope. The journey was far from over, but at least now I had a new perspective on how to keep moving forward. I remember one day in class, our teacher was talking about how we naturally learn new words, and he used an example that really made me think. It was one of those afternoons where the weather was unpredictable. One minute it was raining, the next, it was sunny. I was sitting at my desk, a bit tired from trying to memorize vocabulary lists the night before. The teacher started to explain how some words, especially new ones, come into our lives in ways we don't even realize at first. He smiled and said, "Take the word Google, for example. It's a verb now used in many languages, and it's a word we all know, but none of us learned it from a list." I leaned in a little, curious about where he was going with this. He continued, "The first time you heard the word Google, you probably had no idea what it meant. Maybe someone said it in conversation like, 'Just Google it,' and you were confused for a moment. But then you heard it again and again, because it was an important word in your world. And after some time, without even realizing it, you understood what it meant." As he spoke, I thought back to the first time I heard the word. I couldn't even remember when that was, but I knew he was right. It wasn't something I had studied or memorized. It was just a word that appeared in my life, and before I knew it, I was using it myself. The teacher went on to explain that this is how many words enter our vocabulary. "You didn't need a list," he said. "You learned it naturally, through repetition and context, just like a child learns their first language." I sat there, thinking about all the words I'd been trying to memorize, and how maybe I was going about it the wrong way. Maybe I needed to focus more on hearing and using the language, letting the important words come to me over time.
Just like Google had. It was a simple idea, but it made so much sense, and it gave me a new way to think about learning English. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this was another piece of the puzzle falling into place for me. One day in class, the teacher said something that changed the way I thought about learning English. It was one of those afternoons where the classroom was warm, but the sky outside was grey and dull, typical English weather. We were all sitting there, notebooks open, trying to soak in as much as we could about the language. I had been struggling, memorizing lists of words every night, trying to cram as much vocabulary as possible into my brain. But the more I tried, the more I felt like I wasn't making real progress. That's when the teacher said something that stuck with me. He looked around the room, smiled, and said, "You can forget about lists of words." There was a pause, and I remember feeling surprised. Forget about lists? That's how I'd been studying this whole time. Then he continued. If you really want to learn new words, read stories, read interesting texts. That's where you'll find the words you need, and you'll remember them better. I sat there, thinking about what he was saying. He was right. Whenever I read something in English, whether it was a short story or even a newspaper article, I came across words that seemed to stick with me more than the ones I was trying to memorize from lists. The teacher went on, when you use English a lot every day, whether you're reading, listening, or speaking, the words you need will come to you naturally. You'll start to understand them in context, and that's much more effective than just learning them in isolation. I thought about how often I would read a sentence in English, come across a new word, and somehow understand what it meant, just by seeing how it was used. It made sense to me now, much more than staring at a long list of random words with no real connection to each other. The teacher looked at us again, and with a bit of a smile, he asked, "Does it make sense?" I nodded, along with a few others in the class. It really did make sense. All this time, I had been focusing on memorizing words as if they were just isolated pieces of a puzzle. But now I realized that words are part of a bigger picture, a story, a conversation. And by immersing myself in those stories, in real conversations, I could learn more effectively. It was a simple but powerful idea, and it made me excited to approach my studies in a new way. The journey was far from over, but this moment felt like a turning point. "Yes," the student said with a smile, "thank you." We all nodded, feeling like we had just unlocked a new way of thinking about learning English. As the class ended, I gathered my things and headed out, ready for my shift at work. I worked at a small cafe not far from the school, and by now, I had gotten the hang of it. I remember when I first started, everything felt overwhelming, trying to understand what the customers wanted, making sure I got the orders right. But now, things had become much easier. I knew the routine, and my tasks were starting to feel automatic. It was a relief, really. I felt like I had reached a point where I could do my job without thinking too much about it. As I stood behind the counter that day, taking orders, I realized something important. I could actually understand the customers. Their requests were simple: coffee, tea, sandwiches. The conversations were usually short and predictable, which made it easy for me to follow along. "One latte, please," or "I'd like a ham and cheese sandwich," were phrases I heard over and over again. I didn't need to worry about complex vocabulary or difficult sentences. Slowly but surely, my confidence was growing. I started to feel more comfortable, even brave enough to engage in small talk with some of the regular customers. They would ask me how my day was going or what the weather was like, and I would answer with a smile, happy that I could keep up with the conversation. Everything seemed to be going well, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at ease. But then, something happened. Something I didn't expect. It took me by surprise, and for a moment, I froze. A customer came in, someone new. They looked different from the usual crowd, and when they spoke, their accent was so strong that I could barely understand them. They asked for something I had never heard of before. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what they were saying. It was a little shocking, to be honest. After feeling so confident just moments ago, I suddenly felt lost again, like I was back at square one. The words sounded unfamiliar, and I wasn't sure how to respond. I stood there, my heart beating a little faster, trying to stay calm and not let the panic show on my face. This was one of those moments I knew would come. But I wasn't sure how to handle it. All I could do was smile and ask them to repeat themselves, hoping I would catch it the second time around.